If you enjoy eerie horror stories like this one, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more. Before I even reached the station, I thought back to the path that had led me here. Months earlier, I had been laid off from my job in the city, a place where I had worked long hours for little recognition. The loss came suddenly, a terse meeting followed by a cardboard box of belongings and a hollow goodbye. I drifted between part-time jobs that never lasted, each paycheck barely covering rent, the overdue bills stacking on the table until they felt like walls closing in. I knocked on every door I could, filled out applications until the ink on my pen ran dry, yet nothing seemed to open for me. Weeks became months, and the pressure to find something, anything, grew heavier by the day, a weight pressing down with every sunrise. It was then that an online listing for Hollow Creek Junction's night watch position caught my eye. It did not promise steady income, but it offered something rarer: solitude. The posting was vague, a few lines on a website that few people ever visited, yet it felt written for me. Desperation and curiosity pushed me to apply. During the interview, the supervisor hardly glanced at my resume. He asked only if I could handle long hours alone, if silence bothered me, and if I was prepared to see the night through no matter what. His tone was flat, yet his eyes seemed to weigh my answer carefully. In the end, it appeared enough that I was willing to accept the shift nobody else wanted. I signed the papers, unsure whether I was stepping into employment or exile. Now, with little else binding me to the world I had left behind, the job felt less like an opportunity and more like a refuge carved out of necessity. The gravel road that led to Hollow Creek Station crunched under the tires of my car as I pulled in for the night shift. The headlights swept across the old brick building, throwing long shadows over cracked windows and peeling paint. The station had been standing at the edge of town for nearly a century, and it looked every day of it. The place hadn't seen much use in years, no more than a handful of passengers a week, but the company insisted on keeping it staffed overnight. Tonight, for the first time, that duty belonged to me alone. The wind carried a low whistle as it moved through the iron framework of the tracks. Off in the distance, the faint glow of the town shimmered, but it might as well have been 100 miles away. Out here, the darkness pressed in close. My footsteps echoed as I crossed the empty platform and fumbled with the keys at the main door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and cold metal. There was a loneliness to it, a silence that made you hyper-aware of every movement, every sound your body made. I had wanted solitude when I took this job, but now it felt like solitude wanted me. On the ticket desk, under the weak glow of a wall lamp, lay a laminated card. My supervisor had mentioned it briefly during training, calling it the Night Protocol. He hadn't lingered on the subject, just slid the card across the table with a curt nod, as if hoping I would not ask questions. His eyes had shifted toward the window, his mouth tightening as though the words he might have spoken were better left unsaid. There was no explanation, no reassurance, only the weight of the plastic card in my hand. That unease had made me shove it into the desk drawer as soon as I arrived, pretending it was nothing. But now, with the building sealed and the night stretching long ahead, I pulled it out, the surface cool and strangely heavy against my fingers. I looked out the window. The bench was empty. The platform stretched bare under the lamps, still and quiet as though no one had been there at all. I wanted to believe that was true. I sat back in the chair, gripping the arms until the wood creaked, and let the silence of Hollow Creek Station close in once more. The card listed 7 rules, written in block letters that had faded unevenly with age. My eyes traced them slowly, reading each one under my breath. The language was oddly specific. What to do if the ticket machine printed on its own, how to react if 3 passengers gathered on a single bench, what response to give if the radio called for a report. There was one about the lights in the waiting room, another about the temperature in the building. I frowned as I read. This didn't feel like ordinary company procedure. It read more like superstition, the sort of thing people pass down to make sense of accidents or rumors. I caught myself smirking and shook my head. Old towns always have their stories, I told myself. Maybe it gave the supervisors a sense of control, a ritual to follow through the night. I slid the card back into the drawer, telling myself it wasn't worth thinking about. Still, the words lingered in my mind as I began my rounds. I started with the doors. The front entrance looked out over the parking lot where my car sat under a flickering sodium lamp. The deadbolt slid into place with a heavy click. I tugged the handle twice, just as the rule sheet suggested, before moving on. The side door by the freight platform resisted for a moment before yielding, hinges creaking into the quiet. I locked it and pressed my shoulder against it for good measure. The echo of the sound traveled farther than I expected, bouncing down the empty corridor and fading only after several seconds. It left the silence thicker than before. Back inside, I checked the thermometer mounted on the wall by the ticket booth. The red line hovered just above 68 degrees. No reason for concern. I noted it down on the clipboard as instructed. Then I turned to the waiting room. Rows of green vinyl benches lined the walls, polished smooth by decades of passengers. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale, steady glow. For now, everything seemed in order. The radio sat on the counter by the ticket window, its dial already tuned to the required frequency. I flipped the switch, and the unit crackled to life. Static filled the room, followed by distant voices cutting through at irregular intervals. Dispatchers call locations, confirm signals, and run through the business of railroads. "Cincinnati clear," one voice said. "Pittsburgh clear," followed another. Each report came with a rhythm that was both mechanical and strangely reassuring. Hollow Creek's turn hadn't come yet, but I already knew what my line would be. Station holding. With the essentials done, I settled into the rhythm of the night. I poured myself coffee from the thermos I had brought, its metallic taste familiar. Outside, the platform lay bare under the security lamps. Occasionally, the air carried the distant thunder of a passing freight train on a line miles away. But here the tracks stayed empty. The quiet pressed in so firmly that it felt almost alive. I leaned back in the chair and let my thoughts wander. This job had been a compromise. The pay wasn't good, but it was steady. After losing work in the city, I had needed something to keep me afloat, and Hollow Creek Junction had been hiring. Few people wanted the night shift, so I'd taken it without hesitation. I told myself I liked the solitude, that after years of noise and failure, I deserved silence. But sitting there, I realized solitude wasn't a gentle companion. It was a weight that filled the lungs, a pressure that made the walls seem closer than they were. The first disturbance came just before 1 o'clock. A flicker in the waiting room lights drew my attention, a sharp tremor of brightness that seemed to run along the ceiling like the twitch of a nerve. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing more than a minor fluctuation in the current, the kind of hiccup you'd expect from old wiring strung through walls that had stood for nearly 100 years. Yet the flicker stretched on, longer than a blink, then returned in uneven pulses. The glow brightened and dimmed in irregular rhythm, throwing shadows across the benches that seemed to sway like figures shifting in their seats. Each pulse made the silence heavier, and I found my chest tightening as if the air itself had thickened. My eyes locked on the trembling bulbs, waiting for them to steady, but they kept stuttering until the benches looked crowded with restless silhouettes. A prickling chill moved along my arms. Without thinking, I recalled the words from the laminated card. If the waiting room lights fail, shut off the main power and use the emergency lantern. I forced a nervous laugh, annoyed at myself for recalling it so quickly, but the rule echoed too clearly to ignore. I walked to the breaker panel and cut the overheads. Darkness swallowed the room for a breathless second. Then I lit the emergency lantern and set it on the counter. The flame burned steadily, throwing a golden circle of light that made the shadows seem to retreat. The room looked smaller, more intimate. The silence deepened, punctuated only by the soft hiss of burning oil. The flicker was gone. Everything felt corrected. I returned to my chair, telling myself I had done the sensible thing. That was when I heard the ticket machine. The printer inside the booth rattled once, a hollow mechanical sound. Then it stopped. I leaned forward, waiting. A second rattle followed, as though the gears had shifted. The machine coughed out half a stub before halting again. The strip of paper dangled there, curling in the lantern light. My supervisor had said nothing about the equipment still being active. The last scheduled train through Hollow Creek had been weeks ago. I stood slowly, stepped behind the counter, and tugged the stub free. The paper felt fresh, warm against my fingers. A single line of text was printed across it. I started to raise it to eye level, but something in my chest resisted. The card's words replayed in my mind. Collect the tickets. Do not read them aloud. I slipped the stub into the drawer and shut it firmly. My pulse drummed in my ears. Old machine, I whispered. Old, temperamental machine. But the excuse didn't carry much weight. Minutes stretched, thick and heavy, as if time itself had slowed to test my patience. I sipped at the coffee, its metallic tang doing little to chase away the chill crawling up my spine, and forced my hand across the clipboard. The pen scratched in uneven bursts, my writing stuttering each time the silence pressed too close. I shifted in the chair, rubbed my eyes, tapped my foot against the floor, but the sensation did not leave. It wasn't the vague unease of being alone in a large building. It was sharper, like the prickle of eyes fixed on the back of my neck. A certainty, an awareness that something else shared the room with me, waiting for me to notice. I set the pen down and drew a deep breath. The quiet hummed in my ears. Unable to bear it longer, I rose and forced myself toward the window to check the platform. Through the window, under the glow of the overhead lamps, someone was sitting on the bench. A passenger. His posture was neat, hands folded on his lap, head slightly bowed as if in patience. For a moment, I felt relief. Finally, a sign of normalcy. Maybe he had been dropped off late. Maybe he was waiting for the early train, even though no such train was listed. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the platform. The night air bit at my face. Gravel crunched beneath my boots as I approached, but the closer I came, the less certain I felt. His outline blurred at the edges, as though the shadows refused to give him definition. I raised the flashlight, but the beam seemed to dull against him. His face stayed obscured, never coming fully into focus. I slowed, hesitation knotting my stomach. My hand tightened on the light. One more step, and the air between us grew colder. I stopped. Something in me insisted I shouldn't go closer, shouldn't try to look too hard. The cold air thickened with each breath, mist curling from my lips as though the night were exhaling with me. I forced myself to turn, every step back toward the building, heavy, deliberate. The gravel shifted under my boots, crunching too loudly in the silence, while behind me, the bench groaned faintly as if weight had shifted upon it. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to give in to the urge to glance over my shoulder. When I finally reached the door and pushed it shut with trembling hands, the thud echoed like a vault ceiling. Back at the desk, I tried to weave excuses around what I had seen. Stations always attract wanderers, I told myself. A traveler between towns, a drifter looking for shelter, someone with nowhere else to go. Yet even as I whispered the possibilities, none of them settled into truth. The memory of that blurred figure clung too tightly. The air around him had been wrong, the stillness too deliberate. That presence had not felt like an ordinary passenger. The radio broke the silence. Static hissed, followed by a clipped voice.
Hollow Creek Junction. Status report.
I swallowed, leaned forward, and pressed the transmit button. Station holding, I said, the words coming out steadier than I expected. A pause, then the same neutral voice.
Acknowledged. Good night, Hollow Creek.
The radio fell quiet. The lantern flickered once and steadied. The sound of my own breathing filled the room. The night settled deeper over Hollow Creek Station, and with it, the quiet became a pressure on the ears. The lantern's glow reached only so far, and beyond its circle, the waiting room felt like a cavern filled with stillness. I leaned forward in my chair, hands clasped, eyes drifting to the thermometer fixed above the ticket counter. The red line had been steady earlier, but now it dipped. 66, then 65, dropping faster than the old building should allow. A thin veil of condensation crept across the window, as if the outside frost had found its way inside. My breath steamed faintly in front of me. I reached for the radio, hoping for reassurance, my hand moving more slowly than I intended. The familiar machine sat in its place on the counter, its knobs dull with age, the metal edges cold against my skin. Earlier, the static had carried a rhythm that felt almost like company, a steady wash that kept the silence at bay. Now it came in harsh bursts, the hiss uneven, rising and falling like someone drawing ragged breaths through broken glass. I adjusted the volume and leaned closer. The speaker crackled, spat, then delivered shards of words as if cut apart by distance. Junction, hold, clear. The syllables were hollow, stripped of tone, like echoes in a cavern. I twisted the dial back and forth, but the spaces between voices only grew longer, each pause stretched into a silence that pulsed with its own intent. Then came a whispering, faint and layered, like dozens of mouths speaking at once from the bottom of a well. The sound crawled across my nerves until my fingers recoiled from the dial on their own. I let the set hum where it was and drew my hand back, unsettled and unwilling to hear more. The sound that followed came from the ticket booth, sharp enough to make me flinch. It began with a snap, like a spring recoiling, then grew into a grinding rattle that echoed through the room. The machine was awake again, though I had not touched it. I rose from my chair with deliberate care, each creak of wood announcing my movement, and crossed behind the counter. The printer's rollers clattered and spun, feeding out paper in frantic bursts. One stub hit the counter and curled to the floor, followed by another, then another, until a scatter of tickets lay around my boots. I bent down quickly, my hands trembling as I tried to scoop them up, pushing them into the drawer in messy stacks. But the flow did not ease. The body of the machine shook against the desk, its casing vibrating so hard it buzzed through my fingertips. The smell of hot ink thickened the air, mixed with a metallic tang like scorched wires. With each stub spat out, the sound grew louder, more urgent, until the steady churning filled the room like a drumbeat that refused to stop. One stub caught my eye as I shoved it aside. In dark lettering, it read, Ashwood, last stop. Another, no return. Another, terminus, departure at 2:45. I pressed my palm against the machine, trying to stop its vibration, and nearly jerked away. It was warm, far too warm, as though the motor had been running for hours. My drawer is filled with paper, stubs piling chaotically, the words blurring together. Finally, I yanked the power cord from the wall. The machine coughed once, spat out a half-finished stub, and died. The silence after was worse, pressing down in a way that made my ears ring. The drawer sagged with the weight of dozens of tickets, the wood groaning as if burdened with stones, and yet the building felt emptier for it. The air smelled of scorched ink and hot metal, the remnants of the frenzy still clinging to the room, and in that stillness every shadow seemed to stretch longer, as though the station itself had exhaled and was waiting for me to move. When I turned back toward the waiting room, the benches were no longer empty. 3 figures sat side by side on the farthest row, their backs unnaturally straight, hands folded in their laps like dolls arranged for display. Their clothing was plain but unsettlingly out of place, coats cut in styles I had only glimpsed in faded photographs from half a century ago, with collars stiff and buttons dulled with age. The shoes on their feet had a dull sheen, leather polished but cracked at the seams, as though they had walked too many miles before being set here. None of them moved, none blinked. Their stillness was so complete, it pressed on my chest, and my breath caught at the memory of the card's warning. If 3 passengers sit together, do not approach. I swallowed hard and stayed rooted to the spot. Their presence carried the weight of inevitability, as though they had been in that bench long before I noticed, waiting patiently for my eyes to fall upon them. The lantern's glow crawled only to their knees, leaving their faces in thick shadow, but still I could feel the pull of their unseen gaze. A prickle ran along my neck, skin tightening as if invisible fingers traced it. They were watching. Desperate to appear occupied, I busied myself with the clipboard, pressing pen to paper, though my notes made no sense. The scratching of the nib echoed absurdly in the chamber, too loud, a human sound that felt brittle against the weight of the silence. I forced myself to write, to keep the rhythm steady, as though routine could hold the room together. When I lifted my head again, my stomach lurched. More figures had appeared. 2 now occupied the opposite bench, an older man with a rounded bowler hat pulled low over his forehead and a young woman clutching a worn leather suitcase, the handle wrapped in cloth as though it had been carried across decades. Their postures mirrored the first 3, backs rigid, eyes fixed forward, still as statues awaiting a train that had not come in years. The air grew heavier, thick with their collective waiting, and I realized with a shudder that I was the only one in the room still moving, still breathing. A voice broke the silence.
"Excuse me?"
I froze. The words had come from the woman with the suitcase. Her voice was soft, polite, but carried a hollow undertone, as though spoken from a long distance. She tilted her head slightly, although her features remained blurred and indistinct.
"Do you know when the next train will arrive?"
My mouth dried, tongue sticking to the roof as though dust had filled my throat. The rules had been clear. Do not engage. Their warning now beat in my head like a drum, louder than the tick of the clock. And yet the human part of me, trained by habit to answer, to be polite, to help, pushed forward with the urge to speak. I clenched the counter until my knuckles whitened, forcing myself still, every muscle tight with resistance. The woman did not shift in her seat. She only waited, her blurred face tilted slightly, her suitcase balanced neatly against her knees, as if she had been frozen in that posture for decades, patient in a way no living traveler could ever be. The station clock above the benches, a piece I had never seen working, ticked once with a hollow clang that carried through the rafters. Then again, louder, as though each swing of the pendulum had found new strength. A steady rhythm, heavy and metallic, filled the waiting room and pushed into my chest. I looked up in shock, heart jolting, because its hands were crawling forward minute after minute, edging toward 2:30, even though I had never wound it, even though no current touched its gears. The sound was so sharp it carved the silence into slices, each tick stretching longer than the last. The passengers sat beneath it in eerie reverence, spines aligned, faces tilted as though they were listening to a sermon only they could understand. Tick, tick, tick. The echo of it seemed to vibrate inside my skull, until I could almost feel the rhythm threading itself into my own pulse. The sound drilled into my head, synchronizing with my heartbeat until I could hardly tell them apart. Then the floor trembled. A low vibration spread through the soles of my boots, rattling the lantern's glass. At first, I thought it was another freight line passing miles away, but the rumble swelled, grew closer, and the sound no longer came from outside. It came from beneath. A hollow groan rising through the foundation, as though the rails below the station itself had begun to resonate. The passengers turned in unison, heads shifting toward the platform doors. I forced my gaze away, not wanting to follow. My chest heaved with the effort of staying put. The rumble deepened into a full-bodied hum, a resonance that vibrated the windows until condensation shook free and dripped down the panes. I staggered to the lantern and clutched it like a lifeline. The light trembled but held. Drawn against my will, I shuffled step by step to the glass doors leading out onto the platform, my legs heavy as if wading through water. The handle was slick with condensation when I touched it, and the chill of the metal made my skin sting. Outside, the safety lamps sputtered and flickered wildly, bending shadows across the cracked concrete until the ground itself seemed to ripple. Then, between the rails, a glow began to pulse. At first it was a faint shimmer like moonlight caught in fog, but it grew with each throb, swelling brighter, pulsing like an enormous heart beating in the dark. The rhythm sank into my chest, and every surge of light sent a vibration rattling through my teeth. It stretched down the track as though a headlight were approaching from a tunnel that did not exist, a tunnel carved only in memory or dream. My gut clenched hard enough to ache. There was no train scheduled, no line in that direction, yet the light advanced all the same, humming with a resonance that shook the window panes. Behind me, the benches gave a long groan of wood under shifting weight. The passengers had risen together, their shoes scraping faintly on the floor, a single collective motion that made the air feel crowded. Their presence pressed against my back, a silent congregation gathering closer. Expectations swelled in the room. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, breath fogging the pain, and forced myself not to turn, terrified of what I might see if I faced them fully. The glow swelled until it washed across the platform, flooding every crack in the concrete with a trembling radiance that refused to hold still. It was not steady like a lamp. It shimmered and fractured, twisting as though the air itself had turned to liquid fire. Within the shifting light, I caught fleeting shapes, rows of windows that seemed to open and slam shut, wheels grinding forward only to collapse into sparks, the outline of a locomotive that broke apart and reformed with every pulse. Each glimpse came like the memory of a train rather than the train itself, fragments of metal and motion stitched together by the glow. The sight jarred my balance, and I staggered back, breath sharp, as if the very air in my lungs had warped with the image. I dared to look over my shoulder. Every passenger in the waiting room now faced me. Their faces had cleared of shadow, but clarity brought no comfort. Eyes pale as smoke fixed on me, unblinking. Their mouths were closed, but the pressure in the room screamed their question. When will the train arrive? My throat tightened. I wanted to answer, to scream, to tell them I didn't know. But the words wouldn't leave my lungs. The station clock struck 2:30 with a crash that seemed to split the rafters. The sound rolled like thunder through the chamber, deeper and heavier than its small frame should have allowed. The vibration crawled down the walls and through the floor, and in its wake, every passenger jolted as if caught in the same invisible current. Each one gave a single shudder, shoulders jerking, then froze back into rigid silence. The glow beyond the glass quivered with the echo, rippled once as though resisting, then retreated inch by inch, seeping back into the rails until the platform stood bare. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed the light whole, leaving behind only the memory of its radiance. The radio hissed to life, startling me so sharply I nearly dropped the lantern. Through the static came a clear voice, calm and procedural.
Hollow Creek, all passengers boarding soon.
My blood froze. I stared at the waiting room, at the silent assembly of pale figures, at the empty platform beyond. The lantern's flame bent low in the draft, shadows stretching tall along the walls. Something was coming, and the night was far from over. The lantern hissed quietly on the counter, its circle of light barely touching the benches where the passengers had been. They were gone for now, leaving only the aftertaste of their silence and the cold press of their attention. I sat with my hands wrapped around the edge of the desk, trying to keep them from shaking. My chest still carried the echo of the clock's toll, deep as thunder, and my eyes burned from staring too long into a glow that had vanished. I told myself to breathe, dragging air into my lungs as though it weighed 100 pounds, in and out, slow, steady, deliberate. My ribs ached from the effort, my throat raw with the chill that clung to every breath. Reasonable, I whispered inside my head, forcing each word into a cadence that might anchor me. I had to make sense of what I had seen, had to dress the impossible in clothes my mind could recognize. The human mind will always search for patterns, for order, for explanations, even if it must stitch them from scraps and lies. So I began weaving mine, gathering each excuse like stones to build a wall between me and the truth, clawing at the edges of the room. The ticket machine was old, its casing dented, its gears worn from years of use. Machines can stutter when their wiring corrodes, I reminded myself, and a jammed roll of paper can always burst free in a sudden stream once it clears. That would explain the frenzy I had seen, the stubs spilling like confetti. The passengers, perhaps they were drifters, squatters hiding from the cold, or townsfolk creeping in to play some cruel trick on the new night attendant. People love to invent hauntings to fill the emptiness of forgotten places. It gives shape to the boredom, turns neglect into a story. And the glow on the platform? Light can bend in fog, scatter against glass, and distort through condensation. Fatigue can take those scattered fragments and sculpt illusions sharper than any sculptor's hand, painting visions that feel more real than truth. I repeated these explanations, kneading them into myself like dough, forcing them to fill every hollow space in my chest. Each repetition was a patch on a widening tear. I told myself the rules were superstition, the exaggerated warnings of old station masters who wanted obedience without question, myths passed down like folklore. If I could believe that, I could believe that the night had limits, that it would not devour me whole. Yet when my eyes drifted to the desk drawer, I remembered the weight of the stubs. Paper is not supposed to feel heavy, but that drawer sagged as though it carried stone. My rational explanations withered under that memory. The rules waited in my pocket, folded and stiff, and the silence of the station seemed to hold its breath until I pulled them out. I laid the laminated card on the counter with slow care, the plastic slapping softly against the wood as though it carried weight beyond its size. I bent closer and read every line, lips moving without sound, each word sinking deeper than ink had any right to sink. The words no longer looked like harmless tradition or idle reminders. They pressed against me, vibrating faintly in my mind, each one humming with the force of lived history. Someone had seen what I saw. Someone had endured nights far worse than mine. That someone had written these rules as warnings, not suggestions, for whoever followed in their footsteps. Why these rules? Why are 3 passengers on a bench the danger point? Why never read the tickets aloud as though the sound itself could summon something? The details were too precise, too peculiar to be arbitrary. What had happened to the ones who broke them? My stomach tightened hard at the question, because I knew the answer did not exist in ink. It lingered in the air of Hollow Creek Station, in the damp stones of its foundation, in the silence that lay like a second skin over the building. I traced the letters with the tip of my finger, half hoping the plastic would scorch me and force me to let go. Nothing came but the icy film of the room and the patient rhythm of the clock ticking steadily forward, each strike hammering the rules deeper into me. I had hours left to endure, hours in which the rules would no longer remain flat words on a page. They would bend into choices, twist into demands, each one heavier and sharper than the last, until the night itself judged me by how well I obeyed. The radio crackled at 2:45, a sudden, violent burst that jolted through the still air like a whip crack. The static had been quiet for a long while, almost a comfort, but now it surged back with the harshness of a storm battering glass. I jerked upright in my chair, heart pounding, the laminated card still pressed beneath my hand as though I might draw strength from its weight. Out of the hiss cut a voice, flat, clipped, entirely procedural. Hollow Creek Junction, status report. The answer should have been simple, rehearsed in my mind a dozen times already. The rules had drilled it into me, their ink still echoing in my skull. Station holding. 2 words, nothing more. But fatigue makes traitors of the tongue. My body was slower than my nerves, and nerves sharper than thought. My lips parted before I had gathered myself, and what spilled out was not the rule, not the shield I was supposed to raise, but a single useless word, thin and breaking as it left me. Yes. The radio paused. It was not static. It was silent. A silence so sharp it was a sound in itself. Then the voice returned, but it was different now, warped. The same words as before, repeated slowly but twisted into a question. Hollow Creek Junction, status. The syllables dragged like chains on concrete. My chest froze. I fumbled to correct myself, pressing the button so hard my finger ached. Station holding, I whispered, the words nearly lost. Station holding. The speaker gave one burst of static, then died. At once, the temperature dropped. My breath fogged the air, thicker than before, clinging like smoke. The lantern flame bent sideways in a sudden draft that had no source. I heard glass tremble in its panes, and from the benches came a faint creak as though weight had settled there once again. I turned slowly, my skin crawling even before my eyes confirmed what I already sensed. They had returned, not 3 this time, but 5. They were spread across different benches as though arranged for a grim inspection, yet every torso angled subtly toward me. Their faces remained blurred, features refusing to take shape, but in that formlessness I felt the burn of attention. Their posture no longer seemed like passive waiting. There was an edge to it, a sharpened tension, the tilt of shoulders and the bend of necks that whispered of judgment. Expectation weighed on me, heavy and undeniable. I had failed to answer correctly, and in their silence, they let me know they understood my mistake. I gripped the lantern and walked the room, trying to pretend this was routine, that the weight of their gaze did not stagger me. The thermometer above the booth had plunged below 50. My pulse beat against my throat. I wanted to scream at them, to demand why they were here, what they wanted, but I knew the answer, or at least I feared I did. They were waiting for the train. They were waiting for me to let them board. The floor shuddered. A small vibration at first, then stronger, until dust rained from the rafters. I turned toward the ticket machine, praying it would remain still. It did not. With a metallic shriek, it jolted awake again. Paper rattled against its rollers, and tickets spewed across the counter. I rushed to pull the cord free, but it was already unplugged. My stomach lurched. The machine spun regardless, shaking with its own unnatural will. I caught a stub as it slid past, fingers closing before I thought better of it. The ink still glistened, wet. The words were sharp and fresh. Passenger, Hollow Creek attendant. Departure, immediate. I gasped and nearly dropped it, fingers trembling so hard the stub rattled between them. My name was not there, but the title was. The role. The place I now filled, written as if the machine itself understood who had taken the chair tonight. It had printed a ticket for me, a destination stamped for the living but phrased for the dead. The card's warnings stabbed into my mind with merciless clarity. Do not read them aloud. My pulse quickened, but fear made me reckless, and the silence of the room pressed so heavily on my chest that the words slipped out before I realized. My voice rose above the stillness, hollow in the cavernous air. Passenger, Hollow Creek attendant. Departure, immediate. The room reacted as if struck by lightning. The air cracked, the lantern's flame bowing low, and every figure on the benches turned their head in perfect unison. Their blurred faces snapped toward me with the speed of predators scenting prey. The suitcase woman stood abruptly, her hands whitening on the leather handle, and the bowler-hatted man lifted his chin as though he had heard a tolling bell. A ripple passed through the others, shoulders jerking, hands twitching, movements stiff yet undeniable. The air surged cold, so sharp it cut into my lungs like ice water. My error had summoned them. My error had opened a door I had no right to touch. The radio blared again, but this time it carried my voice, not the dispatcher's measured tone, but my own, distorted into something monstrous.
Station holding.
It repeated again and again, Each playback warped and layered, pitched lower and higher at once, like a choir of broken phonographs all mimicking me. The sound filled the room until it seemed to crawl along the walls. The lantern guttered wildly, shadows leaping higher, stretching long limbs across the ceiling. From the ticket machine came a metallic groan as it shuddered to life once more, still alive despite its cord dangling uselessly. With a grinding cough, it forced out another stub, this one darker than the rest, its paper almost charred at the edges. I did not dare touch it, but even from across the room I could see the letters bleeding black across its surface. Boarding now. The passengers rose together. All of them. Shoes scraped across the floor in a chorus of leather on stone, a sound like countless insects skittering in unison. Their movements were stiff, yet purposeful, as though their joints were rusted hinges suddenly remembering how to bend. Heads jerked, necks stiff, but bodies leaning forward with grim determination. They filed toward the doors leading to the platform, a silent procession gathering speed. My knees buckled and I staggered back, heart slamming against my ribs, the lantern nearly tumbling from my grip. I had broken 2 rules, and the echo of that truth rattled louder than any train. The night was far from finished. They pressed against the glass doors. The safety lamps outside flickered violently, casting strobing shadows across their pale outlines. One by one, hands pressed against the glass, smudging it with fog that should not have existed. Their heads lifted in unison, and though I could not see their eyes clearly, I felt them pierce through me. They were waiting for permission, waiting for me to open the doors. The rules screamed in my mind. Do not let them in. Do not let them out. But the weight of their silent demand clawed at my will. My knees trembled. My hand hovered near the lock. The floor shook again, harder this time, and from beneath the station came that same deep hum I had heard before. Only now it was angrier, louder, as though some colossal engine had awoken beneath the earth. The windows rattled. The lantern nearly went out. The passengers froze, faces turned toward the sound, then turned back to me. The radio spat static. Then clearly, "Prepare for boarding." I stumbled back from the door, clutching the laminated rules against my chest as though the thin sheet of plastic might shield me from the tide pressing in. The edges dug into my fingers, slick with sweat, while my heart hammered hard enough to make my vision pulse. My mind raced, each mistake flashing through me like lightning strikes, impossible to ignore. I had given a wrong answer, my own tongue betraying me. I had spoken a ticket aloud, letting forbidden words spill into the open air. Each act was no longer a slip. It was a chain wound tight around me, pulling closer with every breath. The rules were no longer suggestions. They had become bonds, shackles of ink and silence, and the terrible truth gnawed at me. It was my own hands that had fastened them, my own voice that had cinched them tight. And as the clock's hands ticked toward 3, I knew the night would demand more. Much more. The lantern hissed softly where I had left it on the desk, its glow bending and stretching under every breath of draft. The glass doors still bore the marks of the passengers, dark smudges, like fingerprints burned into the pane rather than fogged by breath. I stared at them for a long time, hoping they would fade, but they did not. They had sunk into the glass, as though the very material had swallowed the memory of the hands that pressed against it. Each mark looked like a wound the station itself refused to heal. The passengers had gone quiet, retreated into their benches or into the corners of the room I could not see, but their absence did not soothe me. It was the kind of silence that lurked with promise, ready to break apart at the faintest move. I forced myself to breathe evenly and stepped back from the door. The floor was still humming faintly, like the aftermath of a distant quake. When I pressed my palm against the wall, it vibrated beneath my skin. The rails outside might have been carrying a train, invisible to the eye but alive in sound and weight. The thought made my stomach twist. Perhaps there was always a train beneath Hollow Creek, circling through stone and earth, waiting for the right call to surface. A sudden sound tore me from that thought. The thermometer above the booth popped, its glass cracking down the middle. Red liquid dripped inside, settling far below freezing. My breath fogged in thick plumes. The lantern flame flickered and stretched, as if struggling to cling to its wick. Somewhere in the waiting room, wood creaked. I knew without looking that they had returned. Hands appeared first, pale and half-formed, sliding across the glass doors. One, then another, then more, until it looked as if a tide of fingers clawed to pull themselves through. They did not vanish this time. The marks lingered, spreading in patterns like frost blooming across the glass. I stumbled backward, gripping the lantern. The flame swung wildly, throwing jagged shadows across the walls. The shadows bent strangely, not matching the figures I could glimpse beyond the glass. Some shadows were taller, stretched out into monstrous shapes. Others had too many limbs. Then, the doors shook. A dull thud rattled through the frame. One of the passengers pressed forward, his shoulder hitting the glass with enough force to make it bow. The metal hinges whined. My heart slammed. Do not let them in. Do not let them out. The words burned into my skull, but the pressure was relentless. The next impact nearly made me drop the lantern. It felt like the glass might shatter, that their tide would surge through and drag me down with them. The station groaned with a sound like timber twisting under a storm. The floorboards buckled slightly under my boots, shivering as though something massive shifted beneath them, and a thin line of dust spilled from the rafters above in a brittle shower. Then the whistle came. It began as a low moan, rising until it carved through the air, a long and piercing cry that felt too raw to belong to metal. It was no natural train horn. It was shrill and jagged, distorted, the cry of something alive and suffering, as though the earth itself had been wounded. The walls trembled in sympathy. My lantern shivered in my grip, flame guttering, and I staggered sideways, hands clamping to my ears. The sound was not content to fill the air. It bored into me, drilling straight into my skull until my teeth ached and my vision blurred with tears. When it finally cut off, the silence crashed down like a heavy door. My ears rang with the phantom shriek, and every heartbeat pulsed with its echo. The lantern flame had nearly extinguished, guttering in its glass like a dying breath. I tightened my grip on it, knuckles white, and forced my legs to move. I edged away from the doors, from the clawing hands pressing against the glass, and faced the arched hallway that yawned deeper into the station. Dark, close, and waiting. I had avoided it until now, but the choice was gone. If I stayed where I was, the glass would shatter under their weight and drag me with them. So I fled into the corridor, shadows racing at my heels, their stretch and twist following me like hunters. The air grew colder as I walked, the kind of cold that gnaws bone and stiffens joints, forcing each step into a slow, reluctant march. The corridor smelled of rust, mold, and a bitter dampness, the stench of things left too long without human touch. My lantern barely cut through the darkness. Its glow licked at the walls but failed to reach the ceiling, leaving the upper shadows heavy and watchful. To my left and right, doors lined the hall like mute sentries, their brass plaques green with tarnish. Most read storage or office, but their letters were worn thin, almost erased. One farther down stood open a crack, and from it came a faint draft that brushed against my cheek, carrying the smell of paper and something older, like dried ink or burned wood. The whisper of shuffling sheets came with it, as if the room itself was breathing. Desperation overrode fear, pushing me forward until I placed my hand on the door and eased it open. It was an archive, or what was left of one. Metal cabinets stood crooked along the walls, their frames warped, drawers hanging half open like slack jaws stuffed with papers that had yellowed and curled. Shelves sagged under the weight of ledgers, their leather bindings cracked and peeled, their pages spilling outward like withered tongues trying to speak. The dust lay so thick it swallowed the lantern's glow, rising in tiny motes that glimmered and then vanished. Yet despite the decay, the room felt disturbingly alive, as though the documents within were still breathing, each page exhaling a story of the dead who had passed through this place. I pulled a drawer open. Inside lay stacks of old tickets, each bundle tied together with fraying twine that crumbled when I touched it. The ink had bled across the years, blurring in pools, yet enough words remained to form a record. Destinations I had never heard of surfaced from the faded letters: Ash Hollow, Coldwater Crossing, Terminus West. No dates marked them, no prices, only passenger names, written in looping cursive that seemed too elegant for paper, so decayed. I ran my finger over the lines and felt a chill when my eyes caught names I recognized. They were not famous, not distant. They were the kinds of names you find etched on gravestones you pass in small-town cemeteries, names that belonged to neighbors, to kin. Local names. Family names. The dead of Hollow Creek and beyond, cataloged in ink as though the station had been keeping its own register of souls for decades. I shoved the drawer closed, heart hammering. My hand brushed a ledger on the shelf above. It fell open, pages crackling. I skimmed a line and froze. It was a log written by someone like me, a station attendant. The handwriting wavered, letters uneven as though written in fear. The rules are not mine, but they hold me. Break 1 and the passengers shift. Break 2 and they move. Break 3 and they take. I slammed the ledger shut, pulse roaring. Dust plumed around me, but I couldn't stop. I flipped through more volumes, hands shaking. The same warnings repeated in different hands, different years. Names signed at the bottom, never followed by another note. Each log ended abruptly, unfinished, as though the writer had been interrupted or taken. A slam shook the room so hard the shelves rattled, and I spun, lantern raised high, its light carving desperate shapes across the archive. One of the drawers had burst open as if yanked by an unseen force, and a storm of papers spilled across the floor. The tickets scattered like brittle leaves in the wind, sliding over one another as if guided by invisible hands. One landed at my boot and slowly turned, as though presenting itself for inspection. My hand moved before my mind caught up, and I bent to snatch it. The paper was warm against my skin, the ink gleaming wet, impossibly fresh, as if it had just rolled out of the machine seconds ago. Passenger, Samuel Whitaker, boarding, now. The name tore through me with a violence words shouldn't have. My grandfather's name. The man who had died 20 years ago was lowered into the ground with my own hands among the mourners. My throat tightened. Blood roared in my ears. I dropped the ticket instantly, a reflex like recoiling from fire, and it fluttered once before dissolving into black ash at my feet. The smell of char and iron filled my nose. My skin prickled with ice, every hair standing rigid. The station wasn't only aware of me, it was intimate. It had burrowed into my bloodline, into memory itself. It had always known me, and now it wanted me to know that. Behind me, the shelves groaned. One toppled forward with a crash, scattering ledgers. A scream tore through the air. Not mine. A passenger had entered the archive. It stood in the doorway, taller than the rest, its face clearer than any I had seen. Hollow sockets where eyes should be, skin stretched taut as wax across bone. Its mouth hung open as it screamed again, the sound both male and female, high and low, vibrating the air until the lantern shook in my grip. My knees buckled. I staggered back as it stepped into the room, each movement stiff, bones cracking under its skin. I bolted toward the opposite door. My shoulder slammed it open, and I stumbled into another corridor. The scream followed, echoing, growing sharper. Footsteps scraped stone behind me, stiff and unrelenting. I ran, lantern jerking in my hand, shadows racing wild along the walls. The hall ended at a stairwell leading down. A draft rose from below, smelling of coal and damp iron. I hesitated only a moment before plunging down the steps. The scream above rattled the walls, but it did not follow me into the dark. Not yet. The stairwell emptied into a platform buried beneath the station. No lamps burned here. Only the lantern's glow revealed cracked tile, rails swallowed by rust, and benches slick with mold. This was a station beneath the station, hidden and forgotten. Yet the air pulsed with life. I could hear the hum again, deeper, closer, as though the earth itself carried an engine. I edged forward, lantern held high. The rails quivered, shedding flakes of rust. Then a light bloomed down the tunnel. Not faint this time. Blinding. It roared closer, the hum rising into a scream of metal. I staggered back, hand over my eyes, as a train without form thundered past. Wind lashed me, tearing dust into my skin, nearly pulling the lantern from my grip. Shapes filled the cars, faces pressed to windows, mouths open in silent screams. They blurred and warped as the phantom cars streaked by, until the last vanished into darkness. Silence fell heavy as stone, pressing against my ears until they rang. My body shook uncontrollably, lungs dragging in ragged gasps that sounded too loud in the cavernous dark. Then a single ticket drifted down through the air, turning slowly as it fell, and landed at my feet. The paper looked new, edges crisp, as though the phantom train itself had just issued it. My hand trembled as I stooped, unwilling yet powerless to resist, and I read the letters stamped in stark ink. Passenger, Hollow Creek attendant, transfer pending. The lantern nearly slipped from my hand, its glass hot against my palm. My stomach clenched so hard I thought I might retch. This was not a record of the dead, it was a verdict. The station was not only a keeper of names but a judge, weighing me, measuring the length of my hours, deciding when to draw me across the line into its ledger. It was not content to hold the dead. It was preparing to claim me as one of them. The whistle shrieked again, this time from the tunnel itself. The ground split with its force. I turned and fled up the stairs, the sound chasing me, rattling every bone. The rules burned in my pocket, heavier than ever. I had wanted answers, and the station had given them. But knowledge came with its own threat. If I broke another rule, there might be no running left. And as the stairwell shook beneath my boots, I knew one thing with awful clarity. Hollow Creek did not forgive. It collected. The station barely held together when I returned to the main hall. The lantern's circle looked fragile, the dark around it solid. Every pane of glass carried bruises from hands that had pressed and scraped. The marks never faded. The clock above the benches crawled toward 4, its gears grinding like breath. The radio pulsed like a heartbeat, each throb carrying a hiss that rose and fell like a lung struggling for air. Between those breaths slipped fragments of words, broken syllables that hinted at messages never whole. I turned the knob with care, and every shift drew a groan from the timbers, as though the building itself protested my touch. I left the set alive because silence felt more dangerous. The rules in my pocket seemed to quiver with each pulse, alive in their own way, a wire already seared into my skin and ready to burn deeper. The passengers filled the room, silent and immovable. When I focused, their faces sharpened into pale remnants of lives long gone. When I blinked, they blurred. The suitcase woman's grip was welded to her handle. The boy's cap-shadowed eyes were too hollow for his age. The bowler-hatted man's chin lifted as if delivering a verdict. Their patience pressed like stone. I felt their weight pressing on me, their silent attention heavy as stone. No safe choices remained. The lines on the card in my pocket seemed to beat like a pulse, each one a command I could not ignore. To obey meant bleeding slowly, hour by hour, surrendering little pieces of myself. To refuse meant being swallowed whole. A tremor rippled through the floor, subtle at first, then rising until my boots vibrated. Outside, the rails glowed faintly, a seam of dull fire stretching into the dark. The passengers turned their heads in perfect unison toward the platform, their stillness more unsettling than any movement. From the radio came a voice, older and steady, the weary tone of a keeper who had once stood where I stood. It carried the certainty of experience. The words only delayed the tide, never stopped it. Each night was another drawer of names, another error, another weight, added until the station itself claimed you. The track light swelled, the doors hummed, the clock lurched. I set the handset down, throat dry. The passengers edged forward, tiny shifts like a tide creeping in. I braced against the counter. The ticket drawer sagged. I pulled it open. The stubs hissed, heat still in them. One carried my title. I held it to the lantern. Its edge curled but refused to burn. The smell of melted plastic choked me. Fire could not erase the ledger. Chains dragged beneath the floor. The walls creaked as though listening. The station wanted me to choose. The passengers moved as one toward the line etched in the tile, stopping at its edge as if some unseen barrier held them back. They pressed closer with each heartbeat, and their faces wavered like smoke. In those flickers, I caught fragments of memory, half-familiar eyes, mouths that almost spoke my name, expressions that belonged to people I might have known. The sight hollowed me out. I lowered the lantern wick until the flame thinned to a trembling thread. Shadows surged instantly, swelling out of the corners to claim the room, stretching tall against the ceiling as though eager to replace the light. With a hand that shook, I slid the rule card beneath the lantern's base and tipped it. The thin flame licked the edge and spread. Letters bubbled and warped into black scars, then peeled away from the plastic as if they could no longer bear to be read. The stink of melting filled my lungs, acrid and heavy, clawing down my throat. My chest swelled, not with relief, but with a bitter triumph, as though I had struck back at something too vast to wound. The clock struck 4 with a weight that shook the rafters, but no chime followed, only silence thick enough to choke on. The radio erupted into a storm of impossible signals, telegraph clatter snapping in bursts, heavy boots pounding as if an invisible regiment marched the corridors, and laughter too jagged to belong to anything human. The sound froze my blood where I stood. I forced my hand to the latch. When I unlatched the door, a blast of wind tore through the frame, so cold it cut the skin from my cheeks. The passengers stirred together, rising in a single ripple of motion, their attention locked on me. I raised a hand, palm trembling, and at once they halted. For a breath, the glow faltered, dimming like a held breath. Outside, the glow swelled and thickened until it was a solid bar of white that split the dark in two. The platform rumbled underfoot as though the earth itself strained to hold still. Shapes wavered inside the glow, faces pressing against windows that were not there. Among them, I saw one that froze me. My grandfather's. Samuel Whitaker, the man lowered into the ground 20 years ago, his eyes pale as mist yet fixed directly on mine. His mouth shaped my name without sound, a command and a plea all at once. The sight hollowed me out. Panic shoved me forward. I yanked the drawer open, tickets spilling in a hiss of hot paper, and shoved fistfuls into my coat. With my other hand, I flung the door wide. The cold struck like a blade, biting through bone, and the glow roared into a shape that was less a train than a devouring tide of pressure and light, rushing forward with hunger rather than purpose. I stepped out. The wind shoved me toward the rails. The passengers crowded the doorway, waiting for the signal. I refused to give it. Instead, I tore the tickets from my coat and cast them into the gale. They burst apart, names scattering like ash, devoured by the glow. The pull eased. I staggered back as the lantern died, the glow folding flat like cloth. I ran through the hall, past the ticket window, and burst into the night. Dawn's gray edged the ridge. Frost cracked beneath my boots. The station's noise followed, the hum of rails, the whisper of a whistle. Lights in the town blinked out, then steadied. I counted until I forced myself to stop. Behind me, the door swung, not latched. The passengers stayed inside. The radio hissed once, then fell silent. I walked down the path into Hollow Creek. Porch lights flickered, curtains shifted. A face watched me pass without knowing me. At the corner, a payphone waited. I dialed the supervisor's number. The old keeper's voice answered. He told me I would never be free, that I'd hear them in pipes, in storms, in my sleep. I told him I knew. The line went dead. Morning crept across the street in pale bands of light, the hills still clutching their shadows as if reluctant to release the night. I walked slowly, each step heavy, frost breaking beneath my boots. The whistle followed from a distance, not loud but steady, haunting like a memory I would not let through the door. Dogs barked in backyards, shutters rattled in the thin wind, and a car coughed awake on a nearby street. Normal sounds, yet every one of them felt sharpened by what I carried. When I turned once, the station loomed dark on the ridge, its silhouette carved against the weak dawn like a scar on the horizon. I no longer keep the card. I no longer mouth the words. In my mind, the drawer stays shut, heavy and locked. The clock that ruled my hours is silent. The radio inside my chest still clicks sometimes, reminding me it has not forgotten. The town will hear the wind whistle through the trees and believe it is only trains. They will dream of crowded platforms and wake unsettled to doors that refuse to stay shut. If anyone asks what happened, I will tell them I walked away with dawn at my back and the station still breathing on the ridge. If they ask what I left behind, I will speak of more than silence. I left my lungs aching with frost, my name carved into the air by every shout, the echo of my steps ringing down empty corridors. The rest, the pieces I could not carry, the whistle claimed for its own, and it will keep them long after I am gone. The ridge holds its line, the sky brightens, Hollow Creek breathes, owing its morning to a choice no one saw. I take another step. The rails gleam once, then fade. The town keeps its lamps lit long enough for me to close my door without turning the lock.